What if I told you that the earliest critics of Christianity admitted that Jesus did miracles and that his tomb was empty, and yet they still tried to discredit him anyway? There were some really harsh critics of Christianity in the early years of the faith. These ancient critics mocked Jesus, denied the crucifixion, and claimed he was a sorcerer. They insulted the virgin birth, called Jesus a coward, and tried to point out contradictions in the Gospels. And actually, a lot of their challenges are similar to arguments we still see from skeptics today. Once Christianity had become quite established and had a large following, but before it was accepted by Rome and Christians were still being persecuted, we do see a few people right against the blossoming religion. The biggest two examples of scathing critiques are Celsus and Porphyry. There are others that made critiques of Christianity, and I'll probably do another video for those individuals. Celsus wrote his book, The True Doctrine, around 175 AD. Now, we don't actually have any surviving copies of the book, but the Christian theologian Origen wrote a whole book responding to Celsus's attacks called Contra Celsum, which means against Celsus, in 248 AD. He quotes Celsus's work a great deal because the whole point of his book is to attack the stuff that Celsus said. Celsus seems to have gone out of his way to make as many attacks against the Christian faith as he possibly could. At times, his attacks go in completely opposite directions, seemingly contradicting each other, because his goal wasn't to find truth. He just wanted to pursue any line of logical thinking he could to discredit Christianity. He mocked the virgin birth, claimed the Christian God was weak and vain, and said Jesus seemed like a coward. He also said Christianity was a religion for the uneducated and stupid, as well as women and children. And he also argued against Jesus' divinity by saying that the body of a god wouldn't need to be nourished by food. Celsus's point mocking the virgin birth is worth going into a little bit more detail for. In Contra Celsum 1:28-32, we see quotes from Celsus where he says that Mary was a poor countrywoman who gained a living through textile work, and that her carpenter husband drove them out after she cheated on him with a soldier named Panthera. Jesus came from a Jewish village and from a poor countrywoman who gained her living by spinning. He was driven out by the carpenter, her husband, being convicted of adultery. She was turned out by the carpenter who had betrothed her, as she had been convicted of adultery and had a baby by a certain soldier named Panthera. The skeptics out there might be wide-eyed in excitement thinking, hey, this is great evidence against Christianity! But realistically, it looks like he's making all this up. He doesn't give any evidence to back up his claims, and there's no record of anyone else ever making this point previously. Also, future writers commented that Celsus and others did tend to make things up in order to advance their cause. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Mary even knew a guy named Panthera, or that she even did textile work. There is some reason to think Mary was poor because her offering at the temple was so small, but obviously that doesn't really help his argument. There are references to Mary cheating with Panthera that came about later, which use Celsus's argument here, like from the Babylonian Talmud, but these came about later and were obviously just parroting Celsus's insults, and once again, no evidence was given. You've probably also heard complaints today regarding the problem of evil, like, why does God allow so much suffering in the world? Well, Celsus seems like he was the first one to raise that question against Christianity specifically, except that he did it from the perspective of the metaphysical problem of evil, which is quite different than how people pose the challenge today. Basically, his complaint about the problem of evil is regarding where evil came from and God's involvement in that. He inserts his own Greek philosophy into the mix to try and say that the Christian God isn't powerful enough to get rid of evil. This is because, from his perspective, evil is infinite and a necessary part of the fabric of the universe. Therefore, the Christian notion of God couldn't be accurate. Notice, you have to grant his Platonist metaphysical views in order to even begin granting his argument from the problem of evil. So it's not really that useful of an argument since you need to agree with him in order to agree with him. He also argued that Greek philosophy was better than Christianity. As we've already seen, he has a strong bias towards his own Platonist philosophical views, which ends up tainting his critiques of Christianity, which is going to be important, as we'll see. Celsus also complained that Christians were against the Roman government and that they wouldn't participate in political offices or get involved with festivals. Now, realistically, the entire complaint here was merely that Christians wouldn't participate in the pagan Roman religious rites. Christians submitted to their government as much as possible, but they wouldn't practice worship of false gods, which then prevented them from entering into politics and participating in cultural events like festivals. To me, this just seems like such a crazy thing to get bent out of shape about. Imagine for a moment you invite your Muslim or Jewish friend over for a barbecue, and you're serving a giant barbecued pig, and they politely say, I'll just have some of the salad, thanks. It would be stupid for you to get offended by this. Them not wanting to ingest pig is in no way a sign of a lack of friendship for you. Celsus is mostly complaining about Christians not being willing to continue in pagan traditions, so he's basically critiquing Christians for not being willing to play the Roman game. He also complained that Christians wouldn't join the military, which was really just the fact that Christians didn't want to kill people. This was a major point of his critique of Christianity, and as you'll notice, it's not actually an argument against Christianity. It's just him asserting his bias. Another interesting thing Celsus complained about, which we see quite often today, is the fact that Christians claimed their religion was actually true. He wrote that he considered Christians to be arrogant for thinking that they had the one true religion. Doesn't that sound kind of familiar to some people today? To understand where he's coming from, the Roman Empire was actually quite religiously tolerant and was even inclusivistic. They basically didn't really argue about what religion was true and sort of treated it as though every religion could be true simultaneously. From his perspective, Celsus would be angry that, out of all the various cultures and religions, the Christians were asserting that their religion was actually true, even though Rome had been religiously inclusive. This is just such a frustrating complaint to me. If something is true, then it's true. And if I pretend as though contradictions to the truth might also be true, then I'm lying. Even if I do it out of politeness, I'm still lying. Realistically, what's more offensive? Telling someone that you think they're wrong or lying to their face? If you get offended that I'm not willing to lie to your face, that's just weird. So, when Christians voiced their exclusivism, meaning that only Christianity is true and other views are false, it's interesting that Celsus acted in the same way as people act today. Today, tolerance is preached all the time, and everyone is supposed to pretend that everybody can be right. However, the moment Christians say that they have the truth, everyone attacks them. And Christians are excluded in this inclusive environment. It's interesting to note how we see this same sort of thing happening almost 2,000 years ago. You'll notice, once again, this argument of his isn't actually an argument, and is really just him saying that he doesn't like that Christians aren't willing to play the Roman culture game. One of the things that he did to attack Christianity directly is he claimed that the New Testament books contradicted each other and had lots of problems in them. He pointed out the very common complaint among skeptics that the Gospels differ in terms of how many angels were present at the empty tomb. Just a quick response to that. 2 of the Gospels only talk about what an angel said and did, and they don't actually say that there was only one angel. Here's an example to show why this isn't a problem. If I go out to lunch with 5 people, one of which being my friend Mike, and then I later tell my wife that I chatted with Mike today, but I don't mention any others, am I contradicting myself? Nope. I'm just not mentioning every little detail, which is fine. Celsus also claimed that Christians changed their story in the Gospels. Some Christians, as if drunk in a riot, alter the Gospel 3, 4, and even many times over, and thereby change its character so as to remove the difficult passages. Now, while this might make the atheists and skeptics excited again, because this is a common point they bring up, there's a huge problem here. Celsus doesn't give any actual evidence for this claim whatsoever. He doesn't say what was changed. He doesn't say what it originally said. He doesn't say who did it, or what books he's talking about, or anything. Now, once again, this opens up another whole can of worms here that we don't have time to go into for this video, but just to briefly respond, we have tons of manuscript history for the New Testament books, and there is no evidence that the Christians were altering the text, and definitely no evidence at all, as Celsus claimed, that the Christians were altering the text anytime a problem came up that they needed to fix. Origen commented on this, and he did it in quite an honest way. I know of no others who have altered the gospel, save the followers of Marcion and those of Valentius, and I think also those of Lucian. These people Origen mentioned who changed the Gospels were heretics, and we can see how they changed the story of the Gospel to fit their own heretical narrative. Origen was willing to admit the times the Gospel had been changed, and said he's not aware of any others. So the only evidence we have of what Celsus is talking about is from heretics who were not accepted as part of Christianity. If he really thought that this was Christians changing the text to fit problems that came up, then that just shows how ignorant he was of the Christian faith. Another point Celsus made that's similar to claims made by people today is he focused on the schisms within Christianity. For example, how people today complain about Christianity having so many denominations. The Christians are split into countless factions, each with their own doctrine. Now, realistically, this happens in every group. Even Celsus himself had people point out that he was a Platonist except when he didn't feel like it. So even he was a schism in his own views, breaking off from traditional Platonism. Every group ends up having schisms like this. Islam has lots of schisms, Buddhism and Hinduism too. Each branch of philosophy has various schisms. So yes, Christianity has lots of denominations today, but this isn't something unique to Christianity, and it's definitely not something that works as an actual argument against the truth of the claims being made by the religion. Just because there are disagreements on minor issues doesn't mean you toss the whole thing in the garbage. Also, for Celsus's point, there weren't actually denominations in Christianity yet. He's almost certainly referring to the minor heretical branches like the Gnostics and the Marcionites, which weren't even really part of Christianity at all. It goes back to the point about the gospel being changed by heretics, which is probably where he's getting this idea of schisms from. It actually kind of shows that he was likely ignorant of the theological points within the Christian religion, considering he's treating it as though this was a real issue within Christianity, rather than outside heretical attacks that weren't considered Christianity. Celsus also argued specifically against the resurrection in different ways. One of which is he said it seems like Jesus was hiding because he only showed himself to his friends. His goal here is to claim that the resurrection never occurred. However, he argues in the opposite direction as well, where he basically says that even if he grants the miracles and the resurrection of Jesus, they are merely like the tricks of Egyptian sorcerers. He even asserts that Jesus learned sorcery while he spent some time in Egypt as a boy. Jesus, who having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers, on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. This is particularly interesting because it seems like he's actually admitting the miracles of Jesus. I suppose this makes sense because just prior to Celsus's time, you not only had flocks of people saying that they saw Jesus's miracles, but you even had quite a few people giving written testimonies of these miracles. Because of this, it would be quite difficult for an early writer to merely say, "Nope, none of that happened." Celsus also tries to attack the resurrection by making an argument that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. The way he tries to do this is he says that Jesus made it look like he was severely wounded on the cross, but it was all a deception, and in reality, Jesus wasn't nearly as injured as he appeared. Jesus, accordingly, as Celsus imagined, exhibited after his death only the appearance of wounds received on the cross, and was not in reality so wounded as he is described to have been. As a first point against this is a really weird claim. I mean, did Jesus get Roman guards involved in some sort of massive conspiracy for his public execution? If so, the Roman guards could be killed for that kind of thing. They're not going to risk their jobs and even their lives for that. Or is he trying to say that he pulled some elaborate trick over the Roman guards, who are professional killers? Now, this gets into the swoon theory counter against the resurrection, which I'll go into in future videos. But basically, while this concept might seem believable to a skeptic, especially today, it's just absolutely ridiculous when you read reports about what crucifixion was like and what it does to the human body. This might seem like a little bit of an odd point at first, but personally, I think Celsus, as well as many other Romans, just didn't really understand crucifixion. Again, that might seem weird because it was such a popular Roman mode of execution. However, the Roman population wasn't really exposed to crucifixion themselves. We can see different examples where historians comment on the brutality of crucifixion, including Cicero, who said that crucifixion was so bad that Roman citizens shouldn't have to see it or hear it or have the idea in their minds, and even that the word cross shouldn't be in their vocabulary. Considering Celsus was a wealthy Greek intellectual and probably a Roman citizen, it's quite possible that he would have never actually even witnessed a crucifixion. All things considered, Celsus almost certainly didn't understand just how deadly Roman crucifixion really was. Celsus is really the bulk of the actual philosophical argumentation from critics during the early church period. However, we do also have Porphyry of Tyre, who lived from 234 to 305 AD. His work that attacked Christianity was called Against the Christians. However, it was actually destroyed by an imperial edict, so we don't have any copies. That said, once again, we know what was in it because it was quoted so much by people like Eusebius, Jerome, and Augustine. One way Porphyry attacked Christianity is that he also tried to say the Gospels contradict each other. However, he did give a few more examples than Celsus did. He gave the same example as Celsus with the angels at the tomb. He also points out that the Gospels differ in terms of the timing of when Jesus was crucified. crucified. I don't want to go into great detail here, but basically, the Gospels describe the timing of the different moments leading up to Jesus' death, and there appears to be a discrepancy between Mark and John, because Mark states Jesus was crucified by the 3rd hour, and John says the trial happened in the 6th hour. Now, Porphyry actually seems to get his details wrong here regarding the problem, but we can see what he's trying to say. The reason for the apparent discrepancy is that John wrote his work mainly for a Gentile audience, and so he was using Roman time, where the others were writing for a Jewish audience and thus were using Jewish time. For Roman time, the day begins at midnight, like our clock does, but for Jewish time, the day begins roughly 6 a.m. So when John says Jesus was on trial at the 6th hour Roman time, that's 6 a.m. And when Mark says the crucifixion began at the 3rd hour Jewish time, that's 9 a.m. So as you can see, the problem totally goes away if you recognize they were using different clocks, because they were writing to different audiences. Another way that Porphyry argued similar to Celsus was that he claimed Jesus was a magician. I'll have to make another video just on this topic because it was a pretty common way that the ancients argued against early Christianity. The people writing at that time couldn't really deny that Jesus did miraculous things because there was just too much evidence saying he did. So what did they do? They tried to say Jesus did supernatural things by means of magic or sorcery. One of the major complaints Porphyry made, just like Celsus, was that Christians didn't follow the traditional polytheism and philosophy of the Romans and Greeks. Now, this topic is super interesting, and I'll make another video in the future to go into this in more depth. But basically, the Greek and Roman empires allowed for cultures to continue their religions, and were pretty tolerant and even inclusive of other religions. However, the Romans forced people to do a small act of submission in the Roman religion so that the conquered culture could be assimilated into the Roman culture. The problem is, Christians wouldn't do that. They considered this act of worship towards a pagan god to be so bad that they would rather die than do it. We see this especially in Pliny the Younger writing to Trajan. Basically, they write that real Christians won't submit to the Roman gods at all, and so they are worthy of being persecuted. The worship of the gods preserves the empire. For this reason, we have established a policy that no one may refuse to worship them, and sacrifices must be made for the emperor's safety. Trajan responds that those who refuse to sacrifice should be punished. One very important thing to note for this point about Porphyry complaining about Christians not submitting to pagan Roman culture is that Porphyry was the student of Plotinus. This is important because Plotinus was a major figure in the development of Greek philosophy. Since Porphyry was Plotinus' student, it's not surprising that Porphyry was a huge advocate and apologist for Greek philosophy. So, when Christians claimed to have exclusive truth and that everyone else was wrong, Porphyry took that kind of personally. He would have probably been okay with Christians worshiping Jesus if they still played the Greco-Roman game of being inclusive and partially submitting to the Roman pagan gods. This gets more interesting because Porphyry accused the early Christians, like the apostles and Paul, of distorting Jesus' original teachings. Now, before the Muslims watching this video get too excited, because that's exactly what they believe about the gospel, what Porphyry was claiming was that the apostles and Paul were going against Jesus' teachings by being against the worshiping of Roman gods. Basically, it seems like he was trying to claim that Jesus originally taught submission to the Roman gods, which would have been helpful for him in his advocating for Greek philosophy. How convenient that Jesus taught exactly what Porphyry was already arguing for. This looks very similar to Muslims' arguments today, where they say that the gospel has been polluted and Jesus actually originally taught Islam. Again, how convenient for you. In both of these cases, we have no evidence whatsoever that the gospel message of Jesus Christ has been changed or that it ever looked anything like Plotinus' views or Islam. So, Celsus and Porphyry are the main and best critics of Christianity during its early years, before the conversion of Rome. What were their arguments? They claimed the Gospels contradict each other, but their alleged contradictions aren't really that impressive, mostly just depending on one Gospel leaving out a detail that another gives, and at times they just kinda get their details wrong. Celsus brings in a little bit from the metaphysical problem of evil, but his challenge is only problematic if you grant his Platonist philosophy. Celsus denied Jesus dying on the cross, which actually works against him because it just shows how ignorant he was of Roman crucifixion. Both Celsus and Porphyry had a problem with Christianity being exclusive in nature, because Christians believed that they had the truth and others were believing in lies. This isn't really an argument, though. It just shows their bias, because they were brought up in a Roman inclusivistic society. For both of them, it seems like their major critique is the fact that Christians wouldn't submit to the Roman paganism. Again, this isn't really an argument, and was just them being so biased that they hated Christians for not agreeing with them. Other than these, it's just a lot of plain rhetoric, using insults to try and discredit the faith, like calling Jesus a magician or a sorcerer, insulting the virgin birth, saying the Christian God was weak and vain, that Jesus seemed like a coward, and also saying that Christianity was just for stupid people and women and children. These arguments are pretty bad. A lot of this actually reminds me of today. People argue against the Christian faith because of its exclusive truth claims. They preach tolerance and inclusivity, but get mad when Christians won't play their game and end up vehemently opposing and excluding Christians while they continue to preach tolerance and inclusivity. People are still complaining about biblical contradictions, but just like Celsus and Porphyry, they show an ignorance of the actual biblical text, and the alleged contradictions are quickly dealt with. Also, people today still try to argue that maybe Jesus didn't die on the cross, even though this is preposterous medically, scientifically, and philosophically. Also, both in ancient times and today, the arguments against the resurrection are literally laughable. And I really do mean that literally. I speak on this topic fairly often, and when I give some of the skeptical arguments, I get a good laugh from the audience, because the things the skeptics try to argue are just so ridiculous, because they'll do anything to try to escape the evidence for the resurrection. Now, we've gone through a lot of the arguments these early skeptics gave, but there's a couple of aspects that I think are crucial to point out. First, they didn't deny the miracles of Jesus. In fact, they seem to grant them as factual. By claiming that Jesus did these miracles because he had learned sorcery in Egypt, or by saying he was some kind of a magician, they end up actually admitting that Jesus did miracles. This is actually kind of common in ancient writers, where it seems like basically everyone admitted that Jesus was doing supernatural stuff. We even read in the Gospels that the religious officials who ended up killing Jesus admitted he did miracles, and they said he did them by the powers of demons. It's also interesting to note that Celsus and Porphyry don't acknowledge the morality and virtue of the Christian religion as being praiseworthy. Later skeptics grudgingly admitted that Christianity had good aspects, like the superior ethics involved, but Celsus and Porphyry never go into this. Personally, I think this shows that they were so skeptical, so wanting to tear down Christianity, that they didn't want to admit any points in the Christians' favor. This is important because when Celsus and Porphyry do admit points in favor of Jesus, like the miraculous nature of his ministry, it's not because they're trying to be objective. It's because it was so inescapable that these elements were true, that they knew they needed to respond to them. A big question for this issue is this: why did the ancient skeptics admit these miracles when skeptics today just dismiss them all as nonsense? The only reason we see skeptics dismiss everything today is because we are so far removed from the events that people don't really appreciate just how obvious the data was to people at that time. It's a lot easier to be dismissive when you're completely removed from the historical context, the language, and the culture by almost 2,000 years. Those within that culture knew that they couldn't deny the data. They knew that Jesus did miracles. This then leads into the second crucial aspect for this discussion I want to point out. Among all the early skeptics, no one ever argued against the empty tomb, not even once. As we can see, Celsus tried to argue that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. Why? Because Celsus knew he couldn't deny the fact that the tomb was empty. Also, he knew that he couldn't deny the fact that so many people claimed to have seen the risen Jesus. Now, yes, this is a bit of an argument from silence, but realistically, these guys were going out of their way to find any and every avenue of attack that they could manage against the Christian faith. They were trying multiple lines of logical reasoning, doubting everything they could possibly doubt, even to the point of making junk up. However, they never even mention any doubt against the empty tomb. In fact, no skeptic ever did. Trust me, if they could get away with it, someone would have denied the empty tomb. They knew that they couldn't. Even the harshest critics knew that they had to admit things like Jesus' miracles and the empty tomb. I'm going to be doing a few more videos on the empty tomb and the evidence involved, so hit the subscribe button for more content on this issue.